There's a word buried deep in the pages of the Hebrew Bible. A word most people have said out loud without ever knowing what it really means. A word that shows up more than 300 times. A word that changed the course of nations. A word that got men killed. A word that made kings tremble. A word that echoes through synagogues and churches and mosques even today. That word is NABI. You may know it by its English translation, prophet. But that word, prophet, doesn't come close to capturing what the ancient Hebrews meant when they said NABI. Because the truth is, the English word, prophet, has been softened. It's been polished. It's been dressed up in stained glass windows and turned into something quiet and gentle. Something you'd expect to see on a Christmas card. But the original Hebrew word, NABI, that word has fire in it. That word has thunder in it. That word means something wild. And here's the strange part. Here's the part that nobody talks about at Sunday school. The very first person the Bible calls a NABI wasn't Moses. It wasn't Isaiah. It wasn't Jeremiah. It wasn't any of the men whose books fill up the second half of the Old Testament. The first person the Bible calls a NABI was Abraham, and he was called that not while he was preaching, not while he was performing miracles, not while he was calling down fire from heaven. He was called that in the middle of a very ordinary, very human, very messy situation. A situation involving a lie he told to save his own skin. And yet God still called him a NABI. And that fact alone should stop us in our tracks. Because it tells us something about this word that most people never think about. It tells us that being a NABI wasn't about being perfect. It was about being called. So tonight, I want to take you on a journey. A journey through one of the most misunderstood words in the entire Bible. A journey through 3,000 years of history. A journey through deserts and palaces. A journey through royal courts and lonely wildernesses. A journey through moments of glory and moments of unbearable grief. Because to understand the word NABI is to understand something essential about human beings and the divine. It's to understand what happens when a person believes, truly believes, that they have been asked to speak on behalf of something greater than themselves. And it's to understand the terrible cost that always seems to come with that calling. Let's start with the word itself. NABI, spelled in Hebrew Nun Bet Yod Aleph, 4 letters, 2 syllables, NABI. The accent falls on the second syllable, NABI. That's how a native Hebrew speaker would pronounce it. And where does this word come from? That's where things get interesting. Scholars have been arguing about the root of the word NABI for centuries. Some say it comes from a Hebrew verb that means to bubble up, to pour forth, like water rising up out of a spring, like a pot boiling over on the stove. Imagine that image for a second, because it tells you a lot. It tells you that a NABI wasn't someone who carefully composed a speech. A NABI wasn't someone who prepared notes and stood behind a pulpit and cleared his throat before he spoke. A NABI was someone who couldn't hold it in, someone who was so full of what he had to say that the words came bubbling out of him whether he wanted them to or not. Other scholars think the word comes from a different root entirely, a root that means to call or to be called. And this idea is just as powerful, because it flips the whole thing on its head. Instead of a NABI being someone who calls out to others, a NABI is someone who has been called, someone chosen, someone summoned, someone whose life is no longer entirely his own. And honestly, when you look at the biblical stories, both meanings seem to fit. These were men and women who had been called. And once they had been called, they couldn't help but pour forth what had been placed inside them. Now here's something worth pausing on. By the 8th century before Christ, the word NABI had become the standard Hebrew word for anyone speaking on behalf of God. That means for about 700 years before the birth of Jesus, if you lived in Israel and you wanted to describe someone like Elijah, or Amos, or Hosea, or Micah, you would use the word NABI. It was the everyday word, the common word, the word a farmer would use, the word a shepherd would use, the word a king would use when he was afraid. But it wasn't always that way. In the earliest layers of the Bible, other words were used. There was the word Roeh, which means seer, as in one who sees. It comes from the Hebrew verb ra'ah, to see. A Roeh was someone who could see what other people couldn't see. Things hidden, things far away, things in the future, things in the heart of a stranger. There was another word too, Hoseh, which also means seer, but with a slightly different flavor. Hoseh comes from a root that suggests visionary experience, as in a person who has visions, a person who dreams dreams, a person who beholds things in a trance or an ecstatic state. And there's a fascinating little verse tucked away in the first book of Samuel. Chapter 9, verse 9. It's one of those verses that most people skip right over. But if you slow down and read it carefully, it opens up a whole world. The verse says, in earlier times in Israel, when a man went to inquire of God, he would say, "Come, let us go to the seer," because the prophet of today used to be called a seer. Now think about what that verse is telling us. It's telling us that the language was evolving, that the older word Roeh was being replaced by the newer word NABI, that at some point in Israel's history there was a shift not just in vocabulary, but in what the office itself actually meant. Because a seer was someone you consulted, someone you went to when you lost something, someone you went to when you wanted to know if it was a good day to plant your crops, someone you went to when your daughter was sick and you wanted to know if she would live. A seer was, in some ways, a private consultant, a spiritual advisor, someone you visited and paid a small fee and asked a question and got an answer. And don't get me wrong, seers did more than that. Samuel himself was called a seer. And Samuel was one of the greatest religious figures in all of Israel's history. But the office of seer had that dimension to it, that personal, one-on-one, question and answer quality. But a NABI was different. A NABI didn't wait for you to come to him. A NABI came to you. A NABI came whether you wanted him to or not. A NABI came to your palace. A NABI came to your marketplace. A NABI came to your temple. A NABI came to your bedroom in the middle of the night, if that's what it took. And a NABI didn't answer your questions. A NABI answered questions you hadn't even thought to ask. A NABI told you things you didn't want to hear. A NABI confronted the king in front of the whole court. A NABI confronted the priest in the middle of a sacrifice. A NABI stood in the city gate and shouted about injustice and idolatry and the doom that was coming if things didn't change. So you can see why the shift in vocabulary matters. The shift from Roeh to NABI wasn't just a change in words. It was a change in how Israel understood the role of the person who spoke for God. It went from something quieter, more consultative, more personal, to something louder, more public, more confrontational. And by the time we get to the 8th century before Christ, the word NABI had won out. It was the word of the moment. It was the word for those thundering figures who stood on the hillsides and shouted at their nation. Amos the shepherd, Hosea the heartbroken husband, Isaiah the aristocrat, Micah the country preacher, all of them NABI. But let's back up, because before we get to those famous 8th century prophets, we need to talk about that first use, the very first time the word NABI appears in the entire Bible. And it happens in a place you might not expect. It happens in the book of Genesis, chapter 20. And the person the word is applied to is Abraham. Now, most people, when they think of Abraham, they think of a lot of things. They think of a father of faith. They think of a wandering nomad. They think of a man who left his home in Ur of the Chaldeans and traveled hundreds of miles to a land he had never seen. They think of a man who was promised descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. They think of a man who nearly sacrificed his own son on a mountain. But they don't usually think of Abraham as a prophet. And yet, that's exactly what the Bible calls him. And it's the very first time the word is used. Let me set the scene. Abraham and his wife Sarah are traveling through the Negev desert. They come to a place called Gerar. Gerar was a Philistine city. Its king was named Abimelech. And Abraham was afraid, because Abraham was traveling with Sarah. And Sarah, according to the biblical text, was a beautiful woman. And Abraham was worried. He was worried that Abimelech would see Sarah, want her for himself, and kill Abraham to get her. So Abraham did something that we today would call, well, a lie. He told everyone that Sarah was his sister, not his wife. And Abimelech, believing this, sent for Sarah and took her into his harem. Now before he could touch her, God came to Abimelech in a dream, and God warned him. God said, "That woman you took, she's a married woman." And Abimelech, terrified, protested. He said, "Lord, I didn't know. I acted in good faith. I thought she was his sister. That's what they told me." And God acknowledged this. And then God said something remarkable. God said, "Now restore the man's wife, for he is a NABI, and he will pray for you and you will live." That's the verse. Genesis 20, verse 7. The first appearance of the word NABI in the entire Hebrew Bible. And it's applied to Abraham, and it's applied to him in a context where he is not preaching, not performing miracles, not thundering against injustice, but where he has just lied to save his own skin. And yet God still calls him a Nabi. Why? Why would God use that word here, of all places, of all times? Well, let's look at what God says next. He will pray for you and you will live. That's the key. Because for the earliest layers of the Bible, the essential function of a Nabi wasn't preaching. It was intercession. A Nabi was someone who could stand between God and human beings. A Nabi was someone who could go to God on behalf of others. A Nabi had access. A Nabi had standing. A Nabi could talk to God the way an ordinary person couldn't. And God was telling Abimelech, "Your only hope is to give this man's wife back and let him pray for you, because he has that kind of relationship with me." And that idea, the idea of a Nabi as an intercessor, is something we lose sight of today. Because when we think of prophets, we think of doom and gloom. We think of finger pointing. We think of judgment. But the original job description was more complicated than that. Yes, the Nabi announced judgment. Yes, the Nabi called for repentance. But the Nabi also prayed. The Nabi also stood in the gap. The Nabi also pleaded with God for mercy. Moses did it. Samuel did it. Jeremiah did it. Even Amos did it, at least at the beginning. This back and forth, this two-way street. This ability to speak to God, as well as speak for God, that was central to what it meant to be a Nabi. And here's something else worth noticing. Abraham wasn't perfect when God called him a Nabi. He had just lied. He had put his wife in a terrible situation. He had frankly been a coward. And yet God still called him what he was. Because being a Nabi wasn't about being sinless. It was about being chosen. It was about being in relationship. It was about carrying a burden that most people would never have to carry. And Abraham carried that burden, imperfectly, but faithfully, for the rest of his life. Now let's fast forward, because after Abraham, we run into another towering figure, and he might just be the greatest Nabi of them all, Moses. And here's the thing about Moses that most people miss. Moses didn't want the job. He ran from it. He made excuses. He begged God to send someone else. When God called him at the burning bush, Moses said, "Who am I? Who am I to go to Pharaoh? Who am I to speak to my people? I'm not eloquent. I've never been eloquent. I'm slow of speech and slow of tongue. Send someone else." Think about that for a minute. The greatest prophet in Israel's history, according to the closing verses of the book of Deuteronomy, tried to get out of the job. He wasn't ambitious for it. He didn't want it. He was living a quiet life in the wilderness of Midian. He was married. He had a couple of kids. He was tending his father-in-law's sheep. He had put Egypt behind him. He had put his violent past behind him. And then God showed up in a bush that burned but wasn't consumed. And Moses' life was ruined. Or you could say, Moses' life was made. Because being a NABI is like that. It's a calling that destroys the life you thought you would have, and gives you a life you never could have imagined. And Moses became the standard, the gold standard, this measuring stick against which every other NABI would be measured. In Deuteronomy chapter 34 verse 10, the Bible says, "Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face." Face to face, that phrase is important because it captures something unique about Moses. Most NABIs got their messages through dreams, through visions, through voices in the night, through ecstatic experiences. But Moses talked to God the way you and I talk to each other, face to face, as a man speaks to his friend. That's the phrase used in the book of Exodus. But even Moses had his limits, because being a NABI is not the same as being God. And there's a moment in the book of Numbers, chapter 20, where Moses lost his temper. The people were complaining. Again, they were thirsty. They wanted water. And God told Moses to speak to a rock. Just speak to it, and water would come out. But Moses was tired. Moses was frustrated. Moses had been putting up with these people for 40 years. And instead of speaking to the rock, he struck it twice with his staff, and water came out anyway. But God was displeased because Moses had failed to represent him rightly in that moment. And the consequence was severe. Moses would not be allowed to enter the promised land. He would only see it from a distance. And that story tells us something important. It tells us that being a NABI came with a heavier burden, a stricter standard, that when you speak for God, you have to be very careful how you speak, because your words carry weight, because people are watching, because a moment of anger, a moment of impulse, a moment of failing to trust can have consequences that ripple through generations. Now, after Moses, the story of the NABI in Israel gets more complicated, because for a while, there weren't many of them. The book of Judges gives us stories of leaders and warriors and occasional prophetic voices. But the office of the NABI, as we come to know, it wasn't fully developed yet. That changes with Samuel. Samuel is a hinge figure in the history of Israel. He stands between the age of the judges and the age of the kings. He was born to a woman named Hannah who couldn't have children. Hannah went to the tabernacle at Shiloh and prayed. She prayed so intensely that the old priest Eli thought she was drunk. But she wasn't drunk. She was desperate. She promised God that if he gave her a son, she would give that son back to God's service. And God gave her Samuel. And Hannah kept her promise. She brought Samuel to the tabernacle as a young boy. She left him there. She visited him once a year with a new coat she had sewn for him. And Samuel grew up in the presence of the tabernacle, surrounded by the smell of incense and animal sacrifice, surrounded by priests and rituals and the ancient rhythms of Israel's religious life. And one night, when Samuel was still a boy, he heard a voice calling his name. Samuel, Samuel. He thought it was Eli, the old priest. He ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." And Eli said, "I didn't call you. Go back to bed." This happened 3 times. And finally, Eli realized what was going on. He told Samuel, "Next time you hear the voice, say this, 'Speak, Lord, your servant is listening.'" And Samuel did. And God spoke to him. And from that moment on, Samuel was a NABI. Samuel's life was long and hard and important. He anointed Israel's first king, Saul. And then, when Saul failed, he anointed Israel's second king, David. Samuel is the one who brought the monarchy into being. He was reluctant about it. He warned the people. He told them that having a king would cost them dearly. Their sons would be taken for war. Their daughters would be taken for the palace. Their harvests would be taxed. Their freedoms would be curtailed. But the people insisted. They wanted a king. They wanted to be like the other nations. And Samuel, sadly, gave them what they wanted. But here's the thing about Samuel. He never stopped being a NABI. Even after he anointed Saul, he stood as a voice of correction. When Saul disobeyed God, Samuel confronted him, face to face. No gentle words, no diplomatic phrasing. Samuel just said what God had said. And it cost him his friendship with Saul, and it cost Saul his kingdom. Because being a NABI means telling the truth even when the truth is going to destroy your relationship with the most powerful person in the country. And this pattern, the pattern of the NABI confronting the king, becomes one of the defining features of the office. It's a pattern we see over and over again. Nathan confronting David after David's affair with Bathsheba and murder of Uriah. Elijah confronting Ahab and Jezebel over their idolatry and their cruelty. Isaiah confronting Hezekiah and his political misjudgments. Jeremiah confronting Zedekiah as the Babylonians were about to destroy Jerusalem. Always the NABI standing the king. Always the NABI speaking words the king doesn't want to hear. Always the NABI risking his life to say what has to be said. And that brings us to another important dimension of the word NABI. The NABI was not a court preacher. The NABI was not on the payroll. The NABI was not a yes man. The NABI was often the very opposite of what we might imagine a religious professional to be. Many of the great NABIs of Israel came from ordinary backgrounds. Amos was a shepherd. He was also, according to his own testimony, a dresser of sycamore trees. That's a farmer. That's a countryman. And yet Amos went up to the northern kingdom of Israel, to the royal shrine at Bethel. He stood there and he shouted about how the wealthy were crushing the poor, how the merchants were cheating with false weights, how the courts were corrupt, how the religious rituals had become empty pageantry. And the priest at Bethel, a man named Amaziah, tried to shut him up. Amaziah went to the king and complained. And then he went to Amos and said, "Get out of here. Go back to Judah. Earn your bread there. And don't ever prophesy at Bethel again. Because this is the king's sanctuary. This is a royal shrine." And Amos, this simple shepherd, looked Amaziah in the eye and said, "I wasn't a prophet or the son of a prophet. I was a shepherd, and the Lord took me from following the flock and said, 'Go, prophesy to my people Israel.'" That's one of the most important passages in the entire Hebrew Bible for understanding what a NABI was. Amos was saying, "I didn't sign up for this. I wasn't trained for this. I wasn't part of any prophetic guild. I didn't come from a prophetic family. I was just a man doing my job. And God grabbed me and sent me here. And I can no more stop speaking than a lion can stop roaring after it has caught its prey." That image, the lion roaring, is one Amos uses to describe what it feels like to be a NABI. It feels like something you cannot help. It feels like something that has taken hold of you. It feels like a force. And every one of the great NABIs, at some point, expresses something similar. Jeremiah famously said, "If I say I will not mention him or speak any more in his name, his word is in my heart like a fire shut up in my bones, and I am weary of holding it in. Indeed, I cannot." That's what being a NABI felt like from the inside. A fire in your bones, a lion roaring, a pot boiling over, something you didn't choose, something you couldn't stop, something that had chosen you. Now let's talk about Elijah, because if there's one NABI who captured the imagination of ancient Israel, it was Elijah. And to understand Elijah, you have to understand the world he lived in. The 9th century before Christ, the northern kingdom of Israel, the reign of a king named Ahab, and his wife Jezebel, who was a foreign princess from the Phoenician city of Sidon. And Jezebel brought with her the worship of Baal, the storm god of the Canaanites. And she pushed that worship aggressively. She fed hundreds of Baal prophets at her royal table. She persecuted the followers of Yahweh. She was ruthless. She was ambitious. She was ready to kill anyone who stood in her way. And into this environment, out of nowhere, walked a man from a place called Tishbe. We don't know much about Elijah's background. We don't know his family. We don't know his upbringing. He just appears on the pages of the first book of Kings, chapter 17, and he walks straight up to King Ahab and says, "As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word." And then he disappears again, into the wilderness, by the brook Cherith, where ravens brought him food morning and evening. It's a strange, dreamlike scene, and it sets the tone for Elijah's entire ministry. Elijah wasn't a systematic teacher. He didn't write a book. He didn't give long sermons. He was more like a lightning bolt. He struck, he thundered, he vanished, and he did it again, and again, and again, until finally he confronted the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel in what is one of the most dramatic scenes in the whole Bible. Let me set that scene for you, because it's cinematic, it's operatic, it's the kind of thing you could put on the big screen. After 3 years of drought, Elijah came out of hiding. He told Ahab to gather all of Israel to Mount Carmel, and to bring the 450 prophets of Baal, and the 400 prophets of Asherah, and everyone came, thousands of people, gathering on the slopes of Mount Carmel, looking down at the plain of Jezreel. And Elijah stood before them all, one man, against 850 prophets of the pagan gods. And he issued his famous challenge: "How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him." And then he proposed a contest: 2 bulls, 2 altars, no fire lit by human hands. The prophets of Baal would call on their God. Elijah would call on his. The God who answered by fire, that God was God. And the prophets of Baal spent the whole morning shouting, dancing, cutting themselves with knives until the blood flowed, and nothing happened. Nothing. The sky was silent. The altar was cold, and Elijah mocked them. He said, "Shout louder. Maybe your God is deep in thought, or maybe he's traveling, or maybe he's sleeping and needs to be awakened." Then, in the afternoon, Elijah rebuilt the altar of the Lord that had been torn down. He dug a trench around it. He arranged the wood. He laid the bull on it. And then he did something crazy. He ordered them to pour water on the sacrifice. Once, twice, 3 times, until the wood was soaked and the trench was full. And then he prayed. A short prayer. Just a few sentences. And fire fell from heaven. And it consumed the sacrifice, and the wood, and the stones, and the dust. And it licked up the water in the trench. And the people fell on their faces and cried out, "The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God." That was Elijah's high point. That was his mountaintop. But here's the part of the story that I think is the most important, because it tells you something crucial about being a NABI. Right after that great victory, Elijah crashed. He heard that Jezebel had put a price on his head, and this man who had just faced down 850 prophets of Baal, this man who had just called down fire from heaven, this man became terrified. He ran. He ran for his life into the desert. He sat down under a broom tree, and he prayed a prayer that has echoed through the hearts of exhausted people ever since. He said, "I have had enough, Lord. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." That's the moment. That's the moment that reveals what being a NABI actually cost. Because these were human beings. They weren't superheroes. They weren't immune to fear. They weren't immune to depression. They weren't immune to the ordinary human weight of trying to change the world and feeling like you failed. Elijah, at that moment, was a broken man. And what did God do Did God scold him? Did God say, get up, get back to work? No, God let him sleep. God sent an angel to feed him, twice. God let him travel 40 days into the wilderness, all the way to Horeb, the mountain of God. And there, in a cave, God met with him. And this is where the story gets really beautiful. Because God didn't come in the big showy way you might have expected. There was a great wind, a wind that tore into the mountains and shattered the rocks. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice. Or, as some translations put it, a sound of thin silence. And it was in that whisper that God came to Elijah. And I think that scene tells us something profound about the NABI. Yes, the NABI calls down fire. Yes, the NABI confronts kings. Yes, the NABI thunders. But the NABI also listens. The NABI also stops. The NABI also waits in the silence. Because the still small voice is where the truth really lives. And if the NABI doesn't have the ability to be quiet, the NABI will burn out. The NABI will collapse. The NABI will run out of fuel. Now after Elijah, his ministry was taken up by his disciple, Elisha. And Elisha was different. Elisha was more settled. Elisha lived in and around communities of prophetic disciples, groups of men called in the Hebrew Bible the sons of the prophets, who lived together, studied together, and served together. These prophetic communities are another dimension of the word NABI. It wasn't always a lone figure. Sometimes it was a whole community. Sometimes it was a school. Sometimes it was a network. And Elisha performed miracles, many miracles. He multiplied a widow's oil so she could pay her debts. He raised a young boy from the dead. He healed a foreign general of leprosy. He made an axe head float. He fed 100 men with 20 loaves. And centuries later, when the disciples of Jesus tried to make sense of who their teacher was, they reached back into these stories. Because Jesus, too, performed miracles that looked a lot like Elijah's and Elisha's, multiplying loaves, raising the dead, healing lepers. And in the Gospels, people again and again try to figure out if Jesus is Elijah returned, if he is a NABI. But let's pause, because we're moving too fast. Let's talk about the great writing prophets, the ones whose books fill up the second half of the Hebrew Bible: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and the 12 smaller books at the end: Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, and each of these was a NABI. Each of them was called to speak for God, and each of them left behind a written record that we still read today, 3,000 years later. Let's start with Isaiah, because Isaiah is often considered the greatest of the writing prophets. Isaiah lived in Jerusalem in the 8th century before Christ. He was, by most accounts, a member of the aristocracy. He had access to kings. He moved in high circles, and yet he was called to be a NABI. And his call story is one of the most spectacular in the Bible. It happens in the temple. The year that King Uzziah died, Isaiah is somewhere in the temple courts, and he sees a vision. He sees the Lord seated on a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe fills the temple. And above the throne are seraphim, burning ones, 6 wings apiece, 2 wings covering their faces, 2 wings covering their feet, 2 wings to fly with. And they were calling to one another, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the doorposts of the temple shook at the sound, and the temple filled with smoke. And Isaiah cried out, Woe is me, I am ruined. For I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. And my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty. And one of the seraphim flew to him with a burning coal from the altar, and touched it to his lips, and said, See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, your sin is atoned for. And then Isaiah heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send? And who will go for us? And Isaiah said, Here am I, send me. That's how you become a NABI. You have to see something. You have to see something that changes you forever. And then you have to be willing to say, Here am I, send me. Isaiah's ministry lasted for decades. Through the reigns of 4 kings, Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, he saw the northern kingdom of Israel destroyed by the Assyrians. He saw the southern kingdom of Judah nearly destroyed by the same Assyrians. He stood by Hezekiah when the Assyrian army of Sennacherib surrounded Jerusalem and demanded surrender. And he watched as, in one night, the angel of the Lord struck down the Assyrian army, and Jerusalem was miraculously spared. Isaiah's book is one of the great works of world literature. It contains some of the most beautiful poetry ever written in any language, and it contains some of the most quoted passages in the entire Bible. The wolf shall dwell with the lamb. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Every valley shall be lifted up, and every mountain and hill be made low. The crooked shall be made straight, and the rough places plain. For unto us a child born, unto us a son is given. Now scholars generally believe that the book of Isaiah, as we have it today, contains material from more than one author writing across different centuries. Chapters 1 through 39 seem to come from Isaiah himself in the 8th century. Chapters 40 through 55 seem to come from a later prophet writing during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century. And chapters 56 through 66 seem to come from an even later hand after the return from exile. This is a debated topic among scholars. Some hold to a single authorship, others to multiple authors. What everyone agrees on is that the book of Isaiah is a masterpiece and that its influence has been immeasurable. Then there's Jeremiah, and Jeremiah is the NABI who suffered. More than any other, Jeremiah paid the personal cost of speaking for God. He was called as a young man. He protested. He said, Lord God, I cannot speak. I am only a child. And God said, Do not say, I am only a child. You must go to everyone I send you to and say whatever I command you. Jeremiah lived through the collapse of Judah. He watched as Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians. He watched as the temple was burned. He watched as his people were dragged off into exile. And throughout it all, he spoke a message that no one wanted to hear. He said, This is happening because of your sins. This is happening because you abandoned the Lord your God. This is happening because you worshipped idols and oppressed the poor and cheated the widow and neglected the orphan. And for saying these things, Jeremiah was beaten. He was put in stocks. He was lowered into a muddy cistern and left to die. He was accused of treason. He was called a traitor because he told the people to surrender to the Babylonians rather than fight. Because he said that resistance was futile, that the punishment was coming, that the only way to survive was to accept it. And this was seen as unpatriotic, as defeatist, as anti-nationalist. And Jeremiah paid for it, with his freedom, with his safety, with his happiness. And yet, Jeremiah kept speaking, because he couldn't stop, because the word was in his heart, like a fire shut up in his bones. And even when he tried to be silent, he could not. And after Jerusalem fell, Jeremiah was carried off to Egypt against his will. And there, according to tradition, he died, still speaking, still preaching, still faithful, even in a foreign land, even among a people who had rejected him. Then there's Ezekiel, and Ezekiel is the strangest of the NABIs. Ezekiel was a priest who was carried off to Babylon in the first wave of exile. And there, by the river Chebar, he saw visions, wild visions, otherworldly visions, wheels within wheels, creatures with 4 faces and 4 wings, a valley full of dry bones that came together and were covered with flesh, and breathed and lived again. And Ezekiel didn't just speak his messages. He acted them out. He lay on his side for hundreds of days as a sign against Jerusalem. He shaved his head with a sword and divided the hair 3 ways. He ate bread cooked over dung. He was a strange man, a difficult man, a man whose whole life became a walking sermon. And Daniel. Daniel served in the courts of foreign kings, Babylonian and Persian, and he had visions of the future. Visions of great beasts rising up out of the sea. Visions of a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven. Visions that have puzzled interpreters ever since. Daniel was a NABI in a slightly different sense, more of an apocalyptic seer than a preaching prophet. His book stands somewhat apart from the others. And then the 12, the smaller books at the end of the Old Testament, each with its own character, its own message, its own moment in history. Hosea, who married a woman who kept being unfaithful to him, as a living symbol of Israel's unfaithfulness to God. Joel, who described a plague of locusts as a sign of the coming day of the Lord. Amos, the shepherd from Tekoa. Obadiah, who prophesied against Edom. Jonah, who ran away from his calling and got swallowed by a great fish, and then delivered his message, and then sulked because God was too merciful. Micah, from a small village, who reminded his people that God required only 3 things: to act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Nahum, who prophesied the fall of Nineveh. Habakkuk, who dared to argue with God. Zephaniah, who spoke of the day of the Lord. Haggai and Zechariah, who encouraged the returning exiles to rebuild the temple. And Malachi, whose book closes the Old Testament with a promise that a messenger would come. And every one of them was a NABI. Every one of them was called to speak. Every one of them poured forth what had been placed inside them. Now let's step back and think about this word, NABI, and think about what it teaches us about human life. Because even if you're not religious, even if you don't believe in any God, even if the Bible is just a collection of ancient stories to you, there's something in this idea of the NABI that speaks to a universal human experience. And it's this: sometimes people are given a burden they didn't choose. Sometimes people see things that other people don't see. Sometimes people feel things that other people don't feel. Sometimes people are called, in whatever way you want to understand that word, to speak up, to name a wrong, to stand against a wrong, to say what has to be said even when it costs them everything. And history is full of such people. They don't always call themselves prophets. They don't always fit the biblical mold, but they carry that same fire, that same lion in the bones, that same inability to stay silent. Martin Luther, standing before the Diet of Worms, saying, "Here I stand. I can do no other." Sojourner Truth, standing before a crowd and asking, "Ain't I a woman?" Mahatma Gandhi, walking to the sea to make salt in defiance of the British Empire. Martin Luther King Jr., sitting in a Birmingham jail and writing about the difference between just and unjust laws. These were not NABIs in the ancient Hebrew sense, but they carried something of that spirit, something of that willingness to speak the truth at any cost. And here's what I think is one of the most powerful things about the word NABI. It reminds us that a single voice can change the world, that one person speaking honestly, speaking bravely, speaking from a place of deep conviction, can move mountains, can shake nations, can turn the tide of history. The great prophets of Israel were not political leaders. They were not military commanders. They didn't have armies. They didn't have money. They had only their voices, and their voices changed everything. Now let's talk about how the concept of NABI developed in later Jewish tradition. Because after the exile, after the return, prophecy in the old sense began to fade. By the time of the intertestamental period, the 400 years between Malachi and the arrival of John the Baptist, most Jews believed that the age of prophecy had come to an end. There were still holy men. There were still teachers. There were still visionaries. But the great voices, The Amos and Isaiahs and Jeremiahs were gone, and the people longed for their return. There was a widespread expectation that before the coming of the Messiah, Elijah would return. This comes from the closing verses of the book of Malachi. See, I will send you the prophet Elijah before that great and dreadful day of the Lord comes. He will turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the hearts of the children to their parents. And this expectation was so strong that when John the Baptist appeared in the wilderness, dressed like Elijah, eating locusts and wild honey, preaching a message of repentance, many people wondered if he was Elijah returned. Jesus himself said that John was the Elijah who was to come, even though John, when asked directly, said he was not Elijah in a literal sense. And Jesus himself was often called a NABI. The crowds identified him as a great prophet. The Samaritan woman at the well called him a prophet. The disciples on the road to Emmaus described him as a prophet mighty in deed and word before God and all the people. And Jesus, like the Nabis of old, confronted the religious establishment. He cleansed the temple. He called the Pharisees hypocrites. He wept over Jerusalem. He predicted its destruction. He was, in the fullest Hebrew sense of the word, a NABI. Though Christian theology, of course, goes on to make much more expansive claims about who he was. After the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70 of the Common Era, Jewish tradition largely came to believe that prophecy in the ancient sense had ceased. The rabbis said that with the death of the last of the biblical prophets, the Holy Spirit had departed from Israel. The age of the NABI was over, but the memory remained, the books remained, the stories remained. And every year in synagogues around the world, the words of these ancient prophets are read aloud. Their voices, though silent for millennia, continue to speak. And in the Christian tradition, the memory of the NABI has been kept alive too. The books of the prophets are part of the Christian Old Testament, and Christians have often understood themselves so to inherit something of the prophetic role. Speaking truth to power, calling for justice, standing with the oppressed. Many of the great figures in Christian history, from the early church fathers to the desert monks to the medieval reformers to the modern civil rights leaders, have been described as prophetic voices. And in Islam, the word NABI survives. In Arabic, it's pronounced NABI as well, and Muhammad is called the seal of the NABIs, the last of the long line that began with Adam and continued through Noah and Abraham and Moses and David and Jesus. Islam recognizes many of the same figures as prophets that Judaism and Christianity do, and it holds the office of the NABI in the highest possible esteem. So this one little Hebrew word, NABI, 4 letters, 2 syllables, has echoed down through 3,000 years of history, has shaped 3 of the world's great religions, has been on the lips of people speaking every language on earth, has meant so much to so many, and yet, at its heart, it means something so simple: spokesman. One called to speak for God. Let me tell you something that I think is really important. When we read the Bible today, we tend to read the prophets in isolation. We read Isaiah, and we don't remember that Isaiah was speaking to a specific city at a specific time about specific events. We read Jeremiah, and we forget that he was watching his country be destroyed. We read Hosea, and we forget that his marriage was a real marriage, with a real woman and real heartbreak. We tend to abstract these voices from their contexts and turn them into timeless truths. But they were not timeless. They were profoundly timely. They were speaking to their moment. They were addressing their people. And yet, precisely because they spoke so honestly to their own time, their words have transcended their time. They have become timeless not because they aimed for timelessness, but because they aimed for truth. And that's a lesson for us in whatever we do, whether we speak or write or teach or lead or parent or serve. The way to say something that lasts is to say something true. Right here. Right now. To the people in front of us. Don't try to sound eternal. Try to sound honest. And if you're honest enough, if you're true enough, if you speak from deep enough down, the words will outlast you. Let me tell you another thing about the NABI that I find fascinating. And that is the diversity within the office. Because when we say NABI, we tend to imagine a single type of person. A stern old man with a beard, shouting on a street corner. But the actual NABIs of the Bible were incredibly diverse. Moses was raised in the palace of Pharaoh. Samuel was raised in the tabernacle. Elijah came from a village nobody knew about. Amos was a shepherd. Isaiah was an aristocrat. Jeremiah was a young priest. Ezekiel was a priest carried into exile. Daniel was a court official. Hosea was a heartbroken husband. Jonah was a runaway. Deborah was a woman. Huldah was a woman. Miriam was a woman. And there were other prophetesses too. Prophecy in the biblical tradition was not restricted to men. Let me pause on that, because a lot of people don't know this. But the Hebrew Bible clearly includes women in the prophetic office. Deborah led Israel in a time of crisis and is explicitly called a prophetess. Miriam, the sister of Moses, is called a prophetess and led the women of Israel in song after the crossing of the Red Sea. Huldah, who lived during the reign of King Josiah, was consulted by the highest officials in the land when the book of the law was rediscovered in the temple. And she gave a prophetic word that shaped Josiah's great religious reform. These women were NABIs. They carried the same fire. They spoke the same truth. They moved in the same power. And this diversity teaches us something. It teaches us that the NABI is not a single type of person. It is not restricted by class, or by gender, or by education, or by background. The only qualification is being called. The only qualification is being willing to say, "Here am I. Send me." Now let's think about the darker side of prophecy. Because we've been talking about the true NABIs, the ones we now honor, the ones whose words made it into Scripture. But the Bible also talks a lot about false prophets. And that's a real thing that we have to grapple with. Because throughout the history of Israel, there were always plenty of people running around, claiming to speak for God. People who told the king what the king wanted to hear. People who told the people what the people wanted to hear. People who prophesied peace when there was no peace. People who cried, "All is well," when everything was on the verge of collapse. Jeremiah struggled with these false prophets constantly. He stood at the temple gate, and other prophets stood right next to him, and they said the opposite of what he said. He said, "Jerusalem is going to fall." They said, "Jerusalem will stand forever." He said, "Repent." They said, "Don't worry, everything is fine." And the people had to decide who to believe. It wasn't easy. How do you tell a true NABI from a false one? The Bible gives some tests. Deuteronomy chapter 18 says that if a prophet predicts something and it doesn't come true, that prophet is not from the Lord. And don't be afraid of him. But that test only works after the fact. What do you do in the moment? What do you do when you have to decide right now whether to listen or not? And this is where the ancient wisdom of the tradition comes in. Because the true NABIs had certain marks. They didn't tell people what people wanted to hear. They usually paid a personal price for their message. They called for justice. They called for mercy. They called for humility. They spoke against oppression. They spoke against greed. They spoke against religious hypocrisy. They lifted up the poor. They defended the widow and the orphan and the stranger. And if a prophet was telling the powerful that they were right in their power, and the rich that they were right in their riches, that was a good sign that this prophet was not from God. Because the true NABIs, without exception, disturbed the comfortable and comforted the disturbed. This is something we need to remember, in our own time. Because we live in an age where a lot of people claim to speak for God, and some of them speak on television. Some of them speak on the radio. Some of them speak in giant auditoriums. And the question is always, who among them is a NABI and who is not? And the ancient tests still apply. Does this person tell the powerful the truth? Does this person defend the poor? Does this person live simply? Does this person love mercy? Does this person walk humbly? By these tests, we can measure the voices of our own age. Let me talk for a minute about the way the NABI spoke, because it's remarkable. They didn't just speak in prose, they spoke in poetry. The words of the great writing prophets are almost entirely poetic. They use imagery, they use metaphor, they use parallelism, they use rhythm. They are memorable, they are quotable, they get inside your head and stay there. And there's a reason for this. Because when you're trying to change a nation, you can't just give a policy paper. You have to reach people's hearts. And hearts are reached through poetry. Listen to how Amos speaks. Let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. That's not a policy proposal. That's a picture. That's an image. That's water. That's a river. That's something you can feel. And that image has echoed through the centuries. Martin Luther King Jr. quoted it in his I Have a Dream speech. It's carved on his memorial in Washington. Because a good image outlives its author. A good image becomes part of the language of civilization. Or listen to Isaiah. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation. Neither shall they learn war anymore. That's not just a wish. That's a picture. Men melting down their weapons, hammering them into farm tools, turning instruments of death into instruments of life. It's a scene you can visualize. It's a scene you can taste. And those words are inscribed on a wall across the street from the United Nations building in New York City. 2,500 years after they were spoken, they still shape our vision of peace. Or listen to Jeremiah. Is there no balm in Gilead? Is there no physician there? Why then is the wound of my people not healed? Those questions have echoed through generations. They were picked up by enslaved African Americans who turned them into a spiritual. There is a balm in Gilead to make the wounded whole. There is a balm in Gilead to heal the sin-sick soul. Jeremiah's ancient question, transformed by suffering people 3,000 years later into a song of hope. That is the power of the NABI. The power to give language to what has never been said before. The power to give shape to feelings that have no shape. The power to give words to the sorrows and the hopes of a people. And once given, those words never really go away. They live on. They get repeated. They get sung. They get preached. They get quoted. They become part of the DNA of a culture. Now let me shift gears for a moment and talk about the NABI in a way that's a little more personal. Because I think a lot of us, whether we're religious or not, feel something like this from time to time. We feel the pull of something greater. We feel a kind of nudge to say something, to do something, to stand for something, to speak up when it would be easier to stay silent. And most of us, most of the time, do stay silent. Because speaking up is costly. Because speaking up makes enemies. Because speaking up disrupts the comfortable life we've been trying to build. And yet, there are moments when a person cannot stay silent. And in those moments, whether we know it or not, we are drinking from the same well the NABIs drank from. We are participating in something ancient. We are joining a long line of people who chose truth over comfort, who chose voice over silence, who chose faithfulness over ease. And here's what I want to say to you. If you ever feel that pull, listen to it. Don't ignore it. Don't drown it out. Don't tell yourself you're not qualified, because none of the NABIs were qualified. Amos wasn't a prophet or the son of a prophet. Moses stuttered. Jeremiah thought he was too young. Isaiah thought he was too sinful. Jonah just wanted to run away. Every single one of them felt inadequate. And every single one of them was called anyway. And every single one of them, in their own way, said yes. Now, of course, not everyone is called to be a public voice. Not everyone is called to speak to a nation. Some people are called to speak to a single family. Some people are called to speak to a single friend. Some people are called to speak to a single stranger on a single day. The scale doesn't matter. What matters is the willingness to say what needs to be said. What matters is the willingness to be a channel for something greater than yourself. And here's the beautiful thing about the word NABI. It doesn't require a special title. It doesn't require ordination. It doesn't require a degree. It doesn't require anyone else's permission. All it requires is the willingness to listen, and the willingness to speak, and the willingness to bear the cost. Let me tell you about that cost, because we've touched on it. But I want to say it more clearly. The cost of being a NABI is high. The biblical prophets suffered. Moses spent 40 years wandering in the wilderness with a stiff-necked people. Samuel watched his sons dishonor his name. Elijah was hunted by Jezebel and collapsed in exhaustion under a broom tree. Jeremiah was beaten and imprisoned and threatened with death. Isaiah, according to tradition, was sawn in two by the wicked king Manasseh. Amos was told to get out of Bethel. Ezekiel lost his wife and was told not to mourn her as a sign to the people. John the Baptist was beheaded, and so on. And there's a reason for this. Because when you speak the truth, you threaten the systems that depend on lies. And the systems that depend on lies do not go quietly. They push back. They persecute. They silence. They try to make an example of the truth teller so that others will be afraid to speak. And this is a pattern we see not only in the Bible, but throughout all of history. Socrates was made to drink the hemlock. Jesus was crucified. Joan of Arc was burned at the stake. Galileo was placed under house arrest. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was hanged in a Nazi prison. Martin Luther King Jr. was shot on a hotel balcony. And countless other truth-tellers whose names we don't know have paid similar prices. And yet, and this is the miracle, they keep coming. Every generation produces its own NABIs. Every generation produces its own voices. Every generation produces people willing to pay the price. And that is one of the great signs of hope in human history. That no matter how many times the truth is silenced, it rises again. No matter how many times the messenger is killed, the message survives. No matter how dark the age, someone always steps forward. Someone always says, "Here am I, send me." Now I want to circle back to the beginning, to that word, NABI, and to that image of a pot boiling over, of water bubbling up. Because I want to make sure we don't lose the wonder of it. This ancient Hebrew word, from a language that most people alive today don't speak, from a culture that vanished thousands of years ago, from a small piece of land at the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea, and yet this word has changed the world. This word has shaped billions of lives. This word has echoed through history like a bell that will not stop ringing. And what does it mean at its deepest level? It means, I think, that the divine wants to be heard. That whatever we mean by God, whatever we mean by the sacred, whatever we mean by the ultimate, that reality is not silent. It speaks. And it speaks through human voices, imperfect human voices, flawed human voices, sometimes reluctant human voices, sometimes terrified human voices, but human voices nonetheless. And there's something deeply humbling about that, and something deeply empowering about that. Because it means that we are not passive, we are not just receivers, we are not just an audience. We are potential speakers too. We are potential participants in the great conversation. We are potential NABIs, every one of us, in our own small way. And if we take this idea seriously, it changes how we live. It changes how we listen, because we start listening for the still small voice. We start paying attention to those nudges, those hunches, those moments of clarity that come out of nowhere. We start to trust that something is trying to speak through us, and we start to have the courage to open our mouths and let it come out. But let's return to the ancient world, because there's something specific and grounded about the biblical NABI that I don't want to lose in the abstractions. These were real people living in real places, dealing with real problems. The crises they addressed were not theoretical. They were about the price of grain. They were about the way judges took bribes. They were about the way widows were being turned out of their homes. They were about the way foreign armies were massing on the border. They were about the way the king had married a woman who worshipped a different god. They were about the way the wealthy were building bigger houses while the poor slept in the streets. And this is important, because sometimes we spiritualize the prophets too much. We make them all about the afterlife. We make them all about heaven. We make them all about salvation. But the great biblical nabis were profoundly concerned with the here and now, with justice in the marketplace, with fairness in the courts, with mercy for the powerless. Amos didn't spend a lot of time talking about heaven. He spent his time talking about how the wealthy of Samaria drank wine from bowls and anointed themselves with the finest oils, but were not grieved over the ruin of Joseph. That is, over the suffering of their own people. That is what got him upset. That is what made him thunder. And Micah didn't spend a lot of time talking about the afterlife. He spent his time asking, "What does the Lord require of you?" And his answer was practical: to act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. 3 things: one about action, one about attitude, one about relationship. Simple, direct, actionable. And Isaiah, in one of the most famous passages of all, in chapter 1 of his book, absolutely tore into the religious pageantry of his day. He said, "What are your countless sacrifices to me? I have had enough of burnt offerings of rams and the fat of well-fed animals. I take no pleasure in the blood of bulls and lambs and goats. When you spread out your hands in prayer, I will hide my eyes from you. Even though you multiply your prayers, I will not listen. Your hands are full of blood. Wash and make yourselves clean. Take your evil deeds out of my sight. Stop doing wrong. Learn to do right. Seek justice. Defend the oppressed. Take up the cause of the fatherless. Plead the case of the widow." That's the heart of the NABI's message. Right there, religious ritual without justice, without mercy, without compassion is worse than useless. It's an offense to God. Wash your hands. Take your evil deeds out of my sight. Stop doing wrong. Learn to do right. Seek justice. Defend the oppressed. That is what God actually cares about. Not the length of your prayers, not the size of your offerings, not the piety of your public performances. This message was radical then, and it's radical now, because human religion has always had a tendency to substitute ritual for righteousness, to substitute performance for practice, to substitute the appearance of holiness for the reality of it. And the NABIs, in every generation, have called us back to what matters. Seek justice, defend the oppressed, love mercy, walk humbly. And this is why the NABIs have been so uncomfortable to religious institutions. Because religious institutions tend to like ritual. They tend to like performance. They tend to like predictability. And the NABIs blew all of that up. They disrupted the temple services. They interrupted the sacrifices. They called out the priests. They called out the rabbis. They called out the kings. They called out everyone. And they refused to be quieted. Now let me spend some time on a NABI we haven't talked about much yet. One whose story is often misunderstood. Jonah. Because Jonah is the NABI who ran away. The NABI who didn't want to do his job. The NABI who was told to go to a great city, Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian Empire, and preach against it. And Jonah, instead of going east to Nineveh, went west. He bought a ticket on a boat headed for Tarshish, which is generally understood to have been in the far western Mediterranean. Modern Spain, probably. As far as you could get from Nineveh. Why did Jonah run? Well, the traditional answer is that he was afraid. Nineveh was the capital of a brutal empire. The Assyrians were famous for their cruelty. They impaled their enemies. They flayed rebellious leaders alive. They built pyramids of skulls outside conquered cities. And Jonah, a Hebrew prophet, was supposed to walk into this city and preach a message of judgment. That would be terrifying. But Jonah himself tells us he had a different reason. At the end of his book, after Nineveh has repented and been spared, Jonah is angry, and he tells God, "This is exactly what I knew would happen. That's why I ran to Tarshish in the first place. I knew you were a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger, abounding in love, and you would relent from sending calamity." And Jonah didn't want that. Jonah wanted Nineveh to be destroyed, because they had been so cruel, because they were Israel's enemies, because they deserved it. So, the NABI ran not out of fear, but out of unforgiveness. And that's a stunning admission. It tells us that even the NABIs had blind spots, that even the NABIs had prejudices, that even the NABIs could be small in their vision of who God's mercy might reach. And it tells us that the office of the NABI included not just those who spoke well, but those who struggled with their calling, those who resisted their calling, those who had to be dragged, sometimes literally, kicking and screaming, into obedience. The book of Jonah, by the way, is one of the strangest and most beautiful books in the Bible. It's short, only 4 chapters, and it packs an enormous punch, and its final image is unforgettable. Jonah is sitting outside the city, hoping to watch it burn. And God causes a plant to grow up over him for shade. And then, God causes the plant to wither. And Jonah is angry. So angry he wants to die. And God says to him, "You cared about this plant that you did not plant and did not tend. It came into being in one night and perished in one night. Should I not care about the great city of Nineveh, in which there are more than 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from their left, and also many animals?" That's how the book ends, with a question, an unanswered question. And it's one of the most moving endings in all of Scripture, because it forces us to sit with a truth we don't want to sit with, that God's mercy is bigger than our prejudices, that God cares about people we don't want him to care about, that God's love reaches places we would rather it didn't reach. And the NABI, Jonah, is forced to confront this. And we, reading his story 3,000 years later, are forced to confront it too. Let me take a step back now and try to summarize what we've learned. What does the word NABI mean? It means, at its most basic level, a spokesperson, a person who speaks on behalf of another, specifically, a person called to speak on behalf of God. It comes from a root that suggests bubbling up, pouring forth, or from a root that suggests being called, summoned, chosen. It appears more than 300 times in the Hebrew Bible. It is the standard Hebrew word for what we today call a prophet. The first person the Bible calls a NABI is Abraham, and it is done in the context of his role as an intercessor. The greatest of the NABIs is Moses, who spoke with God face to face, and who set the standard for all who would follow. The NABIs included figures like Samuel and Elijah and Elisha, who did not write books, but whose deeds and words are recorded in the historical narratives of the Bible. The writing prophets, whose books make up the second half of the Hebrew Bible, include Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and the 12 smaller books at the end. The office of the NABI was open to men and women, rich and poor, urban and rural, educated and uneducated. Its only qualification was the call. The message of the NABIs was consistent. It called for justice, for mercy, for humility, for faithfulness to the one God. It called out religious hypocrisy. It called out political corruption. It called out economic injustice. It defended the poor, the widow, the orphan, the stranger. The cost of being a NABI was high. Many suffered. Many were persecuted. Some were killed. The pattern of the truth-teller who pays a price for the truth is one we see throughout all of human history. After the exile, prophecy in the classical sense began to fade. By the intertestamental period, Jewish tradition largely believed the age of the NABI had come to an end. Though the expectation of a future prophet, an Elijah returned, remained strong. The concept of the NABI influenced Christianity and Islam. In Christianity, Jesus is often called a prophet, though Christian theology makes much greater claims. In Islam, Muhammad is called the seal of the prophets, the last in a long line that includes many of the same figures, and the word itself, NABI, has echoed through 3,000 years of history, across every continent, in every language, shaping the moral imagination of billions of people. That is what NABI means. That is what it is. And that is why it matters. But let me leave you with one final thought, because I think it's important, and it's this. The age of the NABI may or may not be over in a literal sense. That's a theological question that I'll leave for others to debate. But in another sense, the spirit of the NABI lives on. Every time someone speaks truth to power, every time someone stands up for the oppressed, every time someone refuses to be silent in the face of injustice, every time someone says, "This is wrong, and I will not pretend otherwise," in those moments, the ancient fire is still burning. The ancient lion is still roaring. The ancient pot is still boiling over. And maybe, just maybe, that fire is meant to burn in you too. Maybe in your family, maybe in your workplace, maybe in your neighborhood, maybe in your city. Maybe there's something you know that needs to be said. Maybe there's someone you know who needs to be defended. Maybe there's an injustice near you that you have been trying not to notice. And maybe, if you listen carefully, in the still small voice inside your own soul, you will hear the ancient question, "Whom shall I send? And who will go for us?" And maybe your answer will be the same one that Abraham and Moses and Samuel and Isaiah and Jeremiah and Deborah and Huldah and Amos gave. Maybe your answer will be, "Here am I, send me." That's what it means to be a NABI. Not to be famous, not to be powerful, not to be feared, but to be willing. Willing to speak, willing to serve, willing to stand, willing to pay the price. Willing to be the vessel through which truth pours forth into a world that desperately needs it. So, when you read the Bible now, when you come across those old prophetic books, when you turn the pages of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and Hosea, and Amos, and Micah, don't just read them as ancient literature. Don't just read them as history. Read them as an invitation into a long line, a long tradition, a long conversation that stretches from the deserts of ancient Palestine all the way to your own front door. And think about what your own voice might be, and where it might be needed, and whether you might have the courage, when the moment comes, to open your mouth and let the fire out, because in the end, that's what the word NABI means. It means someone who could not stay silent. Someone who chose speech over comfort. Someone who chose the truth even when it hurt. Someone who let God or truth or love or justice or whatever you want to call it flow through them into the world. And the world has never been the same because of them. And it never will be. Because the word, once spoken, cannot be unspoken. The fire, once lit, cannot be unlit. The truth, once told, cannot be untold. And so we honor them tonight. Those ancient Hebrew voices. Those men and women who dared to say what no one else would say. Those who bubbled up. Those who poured forth. Those who were called and who answered. Those who stood in the palaces of kings and did not tremble. Those who walked through the marketplaces of the poor and knew their names. Those who wept for their cities. Those who prayed for their enemies. Those who suffered for their words. Those whose books we still open, whose songs we still sing, whose questions still shake us, whose visions still guide us. They were NABIs, spokespersons of the eternal, vessels of the sacred word. And their story is not over, because their story includes us. If we choose to listen, if we choose to speak, if we choose to be, in whatever small way is given to us, the next voice in the long line. That is the calling. That is the burden. That is the gift. That is the meaning. 3,000 years later, of one small Hebrew word, NABI. And now you know.